Tim Goldstein, autistic adult, and your host for Life in a Neurotypical Universe, where we take a look at life from the perspective of an autistic adult. This is the audio of a presentation I gave for Church Mutual. We did it for Disability Awareness Month. I started out talking about disabilities in general and how often we're just not really understanding and even deceived about what are disabilities by that crazy blue wheelchair sign that seems to say disabilities always means something with mobility. Nothing could be further from the truth, and we're going to cover those statistics in this presentation. Well, thank you to Church Mutual for having me and allowing me to speak to everybody. And everybody else, sit back, enjoy, and I think you might learn a few things from this particular presentation. Thank you very much for having me and letting me talk with this group. I am just impressed as heck with what you as Church Mutual are doing in the whole diversity arena. The engagement you have is just incredible. But as you said, we're going to be talking about, this is Disability Awareness Month, but what we're going to start getting into is, as you mentioned, the invisible disabilities and actually cognitive disabilities, which is where neurodiversity comes in. Now, it's really funny that we look at a wheelchair as being the universal symbol here in the US for somebody who has a disability. The reason I say that is, if we look at the statistics, first off, 25% of all Americans have a disability. So if you're wondering, do you work with any people with disabilities? If there's more than 4 of you, chances are yes. But out of that, 20% of all Americans have disabilities you can't see. They're invisible. And then 1% or less of Americans actually use wheelchairs, which makes you wonder, why did we make the wheelchair the universal symbol for having disabilities? And I think that really throws people off because it really does make us forget or not even learn that disabilities can be so many other things besides being in a wheelchair. So what is a disability? Disabilities have many aspects. It seems like it should be something that, easy to define what a disability is. But the reality is disabilities are complex. Disabilities are complicated. There's a lot of things to them. I mean, first off, obviously a disability can be something physical. You have a physical disability if you have a prosthesis, you have a heart, problem, you have a vision issue that can't be fixed with glasses and such. Be, examples where physical comes in. And then, of course, we have cognitive disabilities, where how you think is actually considered the disability. And the interesting thing is in disabilities, cognitive disabilities are the biggest collection of all disabilities. Then we have the legal aspects of disabilities. In America, of course, there's the ADA, the American with Disability Act, which is what determines whether or not we consider something a disability. And the way that the ADA works is very interesting. It's not a list of conditions or things that you can and can't do. It simply says, if you have a condition that has a major impact on a major area of your life, that is considered a disability. So when you think of it that way, you can start understanding why there's 25% of Americans have disabilities, because there's a lot of people that have something that impacts a major area of their life. And then the last kind of angle we're going to look at disabilities from is identity. And where identity comes into the whole thing is that some people identify as being disabled. And we refer to that in general as being the big D disabled, because they think of themselves as being a disabled person, and that's how they identify. On the other hand, a large group of people who actually by ADA standards are disabled do not think of themselves as being disabled. They identify maybe with their condition, and that's what I fall into. I identify as being autistic. I don't think of myself or identify as being disabled. Now, I recognize ADA gives me, certain, legal rights and such, and I certainly take advantage of them where I need to, but I still don't think of myself as disabled. I just say that's their criteria, and if that's what they want to call it, great. But I have autism. I'm not disabled. So identity is certainly a big piece also of disability. I think, as you said, and certainly, as Pam mentioned, that invisible disabilities. And we're really going to be digging today down deep into one single invisible disability. But just to start with, what is an invisible disability? Well, we had already said, back in the original slide, that 20% of Americans have a disability that you cannot see. And that is what an invisible disability is. And on this slide, we have a few different examples. And, somebody that has a heart condition. You can't see the heart condition, but they may not be able to get up and down stairs and walk from the back of the parking lot to the front. That's obviously affecting major areas of their life. Autism, definitely falls into that. You can't see that I'm autistic, but I am, and it is considered disability. So invisible disabilities are one of those areas where I think having that wheelchair symbol really throws things off because people don't think about all these invisible disabilities. And where I think that really causes a problem is the individuals with invisible disabilities don't know that they actually could ask for appropriate accommodations that could help them because they don't think of themselves as being a disabled person that gets that. So, very simply, invisible disabilities are ones that meet the legal condition by the ADA of being a disability, but if you were to meet the person, talk to them a few minutes, you would never know that they actually had that particular condition. We move over now, we're kind of narrowing down into the cognitive stuff. And cognitive conditions are hidden disabilities, obviously. You can't see inside my brain. You can only see how my brain, makes me act and interact with other individuals. And there's a whole range of things in cognitive disabilities. When we get into cognitive disabilities, we start talking about neurodiversity. And what is neurodiversity? Well, we're going to cover what neurodiversity is in the next slide or two in more depth so you can really get a good handle on it. But basically, neurodiversity means thinking differently. And it's not abnormal for people to think differently. It's actually a good thing that we all think, differently from each other. But when we really start thinking of it as neurodiversity is when we think about big differences in those thinking styles. I appreciate the introduction. That was wonderful. And I would actually like to meet that person. That sounded like a nice person to meet. But I want to tell you a couple little things, just, autism specific about me. First off, my goal really in this whole thing is what it says underneath my name, which is making autism relatable to you. Making it so that you actually feel that you have a grip on it, as opposed to just thinking it's, some people you saw on the TV and, a bunch of young kids bouncing off the walls. Another thing that I think is super important that, I bring up all the time, and I'll probably mention it a ton of times as we go through this, is autistics are individuals. Just like every one of you is an individual, autistics are individuals. And I actually do make a horrible example of somebody who's autistic. I'm here, I'm talking to you, I'm communicating in, public speaking kind of manner. And you normally wouldn't associate that with most autistics, and a lot of autistics are not skilled at that. So don't take me as being an example, just like none of you would be the example of what's the general employee at Church Mutual. Nobody represents the average. So just remember that we are talking in overall generalities that tend to be true, but could be different for any specific individual. And then Another thing I want to bring up is I've actually been fired more times than I think most of you probably have had jobs or will have jobs in your life. Now, not something I'm particularly proud of by any means, and I certainly didn't go out to try and set a record, but it's not unusual for autistic individuals to end up being fired. And we're going to talk through some of the things that causes that to happen. But, as mentioned, I did write a book, and the book was actually written because when you get fired lots of times, you have to interview lots of times. And I got really good at interviewing. And I decided I'd write a book about interviewing for other technical type people who didn't do good at interviewing. So there's a case where, a negative, we flipped it around into a positive. And it actually is very helpful. I mean, not that I'm suggesting any of you go interview somewhere else, but, if you've got friends interviewing somewhere, it gives you some really just concrete steps of how to go and approach an interview and be prepared regardless of whether you're autistic or not. So how do we know what we know about autism? We learned what we know about autism really from children. When autism was first discovered, it was discovered in children, and it was studied in children. And when you're looking and studying in children, you have to do it by observation. So here's kind of an analogy of how we learned about it and how it compares to maybe what the more real world is. If you look on the left-hand side, you can see that we've got some scientists standing around watching a chicken crossing the road. And they're good scientists, came from good universities, great degrees. They're using, best instruments that's available. They're making good records. And they will record it all, and the chicken crosses the road. They go back to the lab. They're watching the videos. And one of them says, I saw there were some flowers on that side that I think was, going to seed. I bet you that chicken was running across the road to go eat some of those seeds. And all the other scientists go, yeah, that makes perfect sense. That matches all the criteria of what we observed. So that's what they decide. Now, we know now that if you're autistic as a child, you're going to be autistic as an adult. Just like if you have ADHD as a child, you're going to have ADHD as an adult. It doesn't go away. It can't be cured. It's just part of who you are. Now, do we get better at covering it up and, learn a few social graces as we get older? Of course, but we're still autistic. So the point being that, we have this chicken that ran across the road, which happened to be an adult chicken, and he's on the right-hand side. And he happened to change his clothes there. He's, now in white instead of in yellow. And we go and ask him, why did you cross the road? And the chicken says, well, you saw those flowers over there? Mrs. Chicken loves that type of flower. I was running across the road to go grab a few of them and take them home in my beak to Mrs. Chicken. Well, the scientists never would have gotten there because they couldn't even imagine that chickens would be motivated by taking flowers home. So I think you can see a case here where what goes on in a chicken's brain and what we come up by just observing them could be very, very different. And it is in autism. Autism in adults tends to manifest and show in quite different ways than it does in children. Unfortunately, the diagnostic criteria were written on children. On this one, what do you see? And I think we decided we're using the QA to have you put in what it is you think you see in this picture. And then somebody else is going to help and actually tell me what's going in, what you're putting in. So if some of you could just throw in there what you think you see.
So we have quite a few with a frog.
You're all winners? Yes, there is a frog.
And then Chris and Tammy said a horse, or Leah. So
well, that you're winners also. There is a horse in there. And if you can't see the opposite ones, just tip your head 45 degrees one way and the other, and then the frog becomes pretty apparent when you're tipped to the left, and the horse becomes pretty apparent when you're tipped to the right. But the point of this whole picture is we're all looking at exactly the identical object at exactly the identical time, and we came up with two completely different ideas of what it is that we are looking at. And that's what happens all too often is we see what we see, but we don't necessarily see what the other person sees. But then we have a discussion about it because we're looking at the same thing, so we assume we're talking about the same thing. And in this picture, if you're seeing, Frog and I'm seeing Mr. Horse, and we're talking about it, we're obviously not having the same discussion because we're not really looking at the same picture, even though physically it is the same picture. Seeing is believing, but the real question is, are you actually seeing the right thing to believe, or are you seeing something that, is different from what the other person sees and believes? So let's jump now and, kind of dive into neurodiversity. And, through neurodiversity, we're going to work our way over to autism. So when we start with neurodiversity, the key tenet to start with neurodiversity is the idea that we accept that eyes can vary. I happen to have blue eyes, not that this camera is doing any good at showing that to you, but other people have brown eyes, there's green eyes. Ears, ears vary in shape, they stick out more. Some have lobes that are attached, some have lobes that are not attached. We accept all of that as just being normal for humans. It's just normal human range of distribution. We don't think that, oh my gosh, if you have blue eyes, there's something wrong with you, fortunately. But we don't think of that about the brain. The brain is the most complex organ in our entire body, and we don't really think about the fact that it should probably have as much, if not more, variability than what you actually have with eyes and ears. And the reality is, modern science and imaging and such has shown us, yes, brains do vary between people. The amount of connectivity, how the connectivity is wired, where it's wired to, the shapes of the lobes, the thicknesses of different areas, there's a huge amount of differences in brains. So in neurodiversity, we accept the fact that human brains vary just as much as everything else about humans do, and that all of those ranges of brains are normal. And then further, that the way your brain is formed and shaped and operates is going to dictate how you perceive, process, and think about the world. So now to pull that into, that concept is kind of cool to know that, yep, there's all kinds of brains and it's, think all kinds of ways, and that's kind of normal. So how do we fit that into anything? And I'm going to use this concept that I created called the neurocloud. And the way the neurocloud works is, first off, any human that's got an operating brain is in the neurocloud. Just like we're all part of diversity, we're all part of neurodiversity, and neurodiversity is just being represented as the neurocloud here. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, all of those little marks are just representing different ways that a person could process, perceive, think, show up, be. So we're really dealing with traits. And I don't believe there's such a thing as ADHD traits and autistic traits. There's only human traits. Now, there may be human traits at uncommon levels or uncommon combinations, but any one of the traits we can find in lots of individuals that we wouldn't label with whatever that label is. For instance, autistics are known for frequently not being able to maintain eye contact very well. And that isn't an autistic trait, even though some people think it is, because we can find lots of people who don't maintain eye contact very well, and they're definitely not autistic. So that's why I say it's all human traits. So now the way that, now that everybody's in there and that we're really talking about all human traits at different intensities and combinations, how do you decipher this thing? Well, think of all those little marks as being like, little pieces of confetti and glitter, and they're all just floating around in that cloud, moving around as things do around clouds. And they start kind of clumping and grouping together. And we end up with this one large group, which is, delineated by that green line that's going around it. And that large group we refer to as neurotypical. And why do we call it neurotypical? It's the vast majority of humans, so it's kind of typical for a human. I like to say if you threw all humans in a bag, shook it up, and grabbed one, most likely you're going to grab a neurotypical because they are the vast majority of humans. There's nothing special about being neurotypical. There's nothing unique. There's nothing, amazing about it. It's just that is the largest group, and they tend to think in similar kind of approaches and manners. Yes, we're all individuals. Yes, everybody is going to think a little different, But in general, neurotypicals tend to be fairly social oriented and concerned about social and how interaction is with social things. Now, if we go to the area outside of the green in the neurocloud, we step into the area that I refer to as neurodistinct. Question is now, how do we tell the difference? Is there somebody is neurotypical or neurodistinct? And the answer is, it's a fuzzy line. It's not just a, step over this line and you've changed completely. It really is fuzzy. You could have somebody that's neurotypical but shows, some really distinct characteristics, or you could have somebody that is neurodistinct and, shows a lot of neurotypical characteristics. So again, fuzzy line, the definition is, though, somebody is neurodistinct if they perceive, process, and think in a distinctly different manner than neurotypicals do. So when you deal with autistics, we tend to think and process and deal with things from a logical standpoint. And again, that's a generalization. There's all types of autistics in all kinds of careers, but there is a huge amount of us in the tech world. And we can, have that on both sides of the fence. So it's not a defining characteristic, it just happens to be. The big takeaways from this is really all humans fit inside the neurocloud. All traits are just human traits at varying levels of intensity and combinations. And the further apart you are in the neurocloud, the more challenging communication is going to be because you perceive, think, and process in a different manner. Even if you're in the neurotypicals, you can be far apart in the ways you think and process, which is going to be a challenge. If you have to go over the NT-ND line, and NT is abbreviation we use for neurotypical often, ND, abbreviation we use often for neurodistinct. And if you have to go over that line, just think about it as being you got to go a lot further distance in order to communicate well. So big takeaways from this here is simply two groups when we're dealing with all of humans. Neurotypical, largest group, tends to set all the social norms and expectations. Neurodistinct thinks in distinctly different ways and tends to have a little struggle dealing with the general neurotypical world because it just does not compute for them because they do think and perceive and process in different ways. So how different can you think and process about things? I'm going to tell you a little story here that this is a personal story. And I, like a lot of autistics, will eat the exact same thing for, for me, it's about 1.5 years, 2 years in a row. So for lunch, I would always have the same thing. And I was on a kick where it was roast beef sandwiches on potato bread. I mean, it certainly wasn't a health kick by any means, but that was the kick I was on. And my wife and I would go shopping and we'd go to the mart, and it happened to be a place where they didn't necessarily stock things exactly in the same spot every time. And we'd step into the bread aisle, and I'd start looking up and down and scanning up and down, reading the ends of the labels. Because the information, of course, is in the text. Where else would information be but in the words? My wife, in the meantime, would just stand back, point somewhere, and go, honey, it's right over there. And I'd sheepishly walk over, grab it, and put it in the cart. About 1.5 years later, I finally asked her, how do you do that? You just step in the aisle, I'm hunting all over, and you just bang, point right at the thing. And what she said to me was, it's really simple. I just look for the big orange circle on the end of the wrapper. It's the only brand and flavor that has that orange circle. Oh my gosh, I've been reading the words thinking about the information. She was just looking for any identifying marks because she didn't care about all the rest of the words. She knew that was the right thing. I think that kind of shows two very, very different approaches to processing, doing the exact same thing. And that's why you want neurodiversity in your company. You want people looking at it from a number of different aspects. Of course, in this case, she had definitely the much better way. Unfortunately, I didn't have the better way here. Sometimes, though, I do have the better way. So just to summarize neurodiversity, I'm just going to go through a couple terms, and I'm going to compare them up to diversity. Because you do such a great job in diversity, I think all of you will understand the diversity terms real well, so I think this will be helpful to you. First off, neurodiversity, just like diversity, means all humans. There's not just, certain groups that are in diversity and only certain groups that are neurodiversity. No, it's all humans are in there. Are there some groups that, have more struggle, have had different disadvantages, things like that? Yes, of course there is. But all humans are still in there. So when we have the concept is simply, we talk about it as diversity. Generally looking at things from the outside, although there certainly are things such as LGBTQ+, where, it's not visible, but in the majority of diversity, it's outward kind of things. Neurodiversity, we're thinking and looking at how does somebody think? How do they process? And that's what neurodiversity is all about. Now, if we go to the group makeups, what's the composition of a group? We walk by a conference room that's got a whole pile of people in it, and, we're in the DEI group, so we're chatting about, diversity and such. And we say to each other, geez, well, how diverse do you think that group was? So we use the term diverse to define how the makeup of a group is. And correspondingly, when we're talking about neurodiversity, we use the term neurodiverse. How neurodiverse was that group? So obviously those are adjectives. They're modifying what the group makeup is. Then finally we get down to what I labeled as base groups because I couldn't figure out anything else to call it. And I didn't do diversity full justice because there's a lot more groups in diversity than I listed. I just kind of picked two of the really, really big groupings. So lots of different groups in diversity. When we go to neurodiversity now, we've already talked about there being two groups. There's neurotypicals and there's neurodistinct. So that makes it really easy. There's only two groups. Now, you'll often hear in the US particularly people describing an individual as being neurodiverse, which if you want to follow the rules of English grammar, you cannot be an adjective. So neurodiverse really is not appropriately used for an individual. It's used for the definition of a group, and for an individual, neurotypical, neurodistinct. So I think that might kind of wrap up for you a little bit of just getting a handle of feeling comfortable with those terms, or hopefully it will make you feel comfortable with those terms. So we're now going to start getting into some things that are very autism oriented. And one of the big challenges with autism is you don't know what to expect. You don't know about that person, how they interact, how they deal with things, where their strengths are, where their weaknesses are. And, in the corporate world, we use all kinds of these different survey instruments. There's DISC, there's, Briggs-Myers, and there's a whole pile of those. And they're certainly useful to a certain extent, but because they reduce you down to 4 letters or, 6 quadrants or, whatever it is, we wipe out and kind of obliterate the really fine differences that you may have and turn it into an overall generalization. Is it useful? Yeah, it definitely has some use to it. But I went and created this idea of interactional indicators to give you a much better idea of what it would be like interacting with another individual. Now, I'm sure you can't read the actual names that are going around the individual charts. So I went and put the list on the left, and those are just categories. They're not the actual questions. For instance, in the communication skills, we don't just ask how good are you communicating. It asks how good are you communicating one-on-one? How good are you communicating to a group? How much struggle is it for you to interpret emotional communication? Things like that. So we have lots of fine-grained points. And to help you kind of understand that, if we go over to the charts, and these are actually my charts. So this is me. You're learning more about me than my mother probably even used to know. And the bottom left one is the communication one that we're going to focus on right now. And the way you interpret these is, the more blue that you see, the more challenge that there is in communication, or in that particular area it's under. And obviously we're talking about communication here. And when you look at mine, I have what I refer to, and a lot of people refer to, as a very distinct profile. Some people call them spiky profiles. A lot of us call them distinct profiles. And you can see, In communication, I have areas where I don't struggle very much. And I'm here talking to you, doing public speaking, so you would kind of guess I'm probably a pretty, fair communicator. But you also see in communication, there's areas with huge amounts of blue where I struggle like crazy. And what that is, I'm actually pretty good at outbound communication. But inward coming communication, I don't pick up the nuances. I don't pick up the emotional cues. I don't pick up a lot of things. I get the words. And we're going to talk more about that in an upcoming slide. But I think you can see if you were to look at this and have seen that and then you're going to sit down and talk with me, you're going to recognize that I'm going to be able to communicate pretty well to you, but you better make sure that I understood what it was you said because I struggle with inbound communication. And I think that gives a lot better detail than if we just average communication out, because I'd end up being about in the middle as an average communicator. And you'd have no idea that, no, I'm strong one direction, but really weak in the other direction. These, by the way, also happen to work very well for neurotypicals. You don't have to be neurodistinct. The charts tend to be a less blue area with a neurotypical, but it still tells you a huge amount between where they have strengths and where they have challenges. And if any of you want to go try it, that URL at the bottom will take you right to it. It's totally free and totally private, no private information collected. And it is case sensitive, so do it in lower case. So communication, as I said, we want to talk a little bit about communication because in autism, the definitions of autism, and we won't worry about really the childhood pieces, we'll just kind of talk in a little more generality, is a challenge in communication and a challenge in social interaction. I'm pretty well convinced that the challenge in social interaction comes from the challenge in communication. And the communication then leads to the social faux pas. So let's just kind of run through this really quick. And there's really two things on here. One is there's just basic communication theory. And we're going to run through that one first fast, just so you can kind of understand where communication can go wrong just in general. And then we're going to talk about, in specific, dealing with autistic individuals, how communication can go even more wrong. So when we look at this, we're going to say that the right-hand side of it is neurotypical, and we're going to say that the left-hand side of it is neurodistinct. And for the general communication theory, it doesn't matter, but for the autistic part, that will matter. So what you have, so we're going to start on the right, you have those different ovals, and all those different ovals are representing is the different ways that people think and process about things. Some people work in words, some people work in pictures, some people, work in patterns. There's all different ways that people use their brains to do what we need to do. So the first thing you do is you take however it is that you have that thing in your brain and you go and you put it into a word, and you got to crunch it down and fit it into a word. So we probably lost a lot of context that was in your brain that wasn't in the word. Then the dotted line going across is a communication channel. So you take that word and you send it across the communication channel. I think, with pandemic and working from home and all that, we've probably all been on a Zoom meeting where somebody had a bad internet connection. And they faded in and they faded out and they crackled and there'd be a pause and then the rest of the words would come through. We can lose a lot of information and fidelity through the communication channel. Then when we get to the far side, person gets whatever they were managed to get through the communication channel. They take those words that were the best words the person could come up with, and they have to unpack them and turn them into the way their brain works and operates on things. So particularly when you have people who have different styles of how their brains work on things, you can see why there can be misunderstanding and we can end up with frogs and horses even though we think we actually talked about the same thing. So that's just general communication theory and how things can go wrong. It's kind of good to understand because it points out the areas where you really should validate in communication that everybody's in sync. But if we look at the pictures now in the middle, this is where the autistic piece come in. And we're going to do first going from the side of the neurotypical side over to the neurodistinct side. And when you look, and that's in the bottom picture. When you look at that bottom picture, what happens is you have the neurotypical, and I am convinced that neurotypicals communicate in three channels or three modes simultaneously. And what those three channels or modes are is they use words, obviously, but they also use tonality. And we can totally flip the meaning of a word by just changing the tonality that we use with that particular word. And then last but not least, we have body, facial expressions, body, positions, things like that. Those also can totally flip around and change the meanings of the communication in the words. Now that black thing you see kind of sticking up and down in that picture is a wall. And I'm on the other side of the wall. And this is actually how things work exactly for me. Not all autistic. Some autistics don't have some of these challenges, but this is relatively common. I have this little window, and through this little window, I get words. And I take those words, completely literally. And whatever it literally means, first dictionary definition is what I take the word as meaning. And I don't get your tonality, and I don't get the body and facial expressions. It's like it hits the wall and just bounces off. They don't even get to me. My brain doesn't get it, doesn't process it. So I think you can see there where there's already one place that communication can go completely wrong. You used words that literally meant one thing, but you put in tonality and body and facial language that meant that's really not what I mean. I really mean the opposite of what I just actually said in the words. But I'm going to go off the words of what you said because that's all I got out of it. Very big disconnect in communication. Now, kind of interesting when we go around the other direction. So we flip it around, and now I'm saying something. And when I say I'm saying something and I'm telling you the way it's going to work, you're going to say, that doesn't make any sense because you're not doing that. Well, I don't talk the way that is stereotypical for somebody who is autistic. I actually had the good fortune of going and studying with one of the best vocal coaches in the world. And from him, I was able to learn how to put emotion in my voice, which is what he teaches the singers and actors that you would know if I said the names immediately. And, it's changed how I communicate completely. So now I have tonality and emotionality in my communication. So I'm going to kind of do a parody here of what a more traditional autistic individual would sound like communicating. And it's kind of similar to what I sounded like before I was taught how to do it differently. So overall, we tend to talk as an autistic as very flat and very monotone, and we go at the same pace, and every word's exactly the same length, and none of them are louder, none of them are softer. And matter of fact, we barely even use commas, and we barely even use periods. We just kind of keep going on and on and on until you just fall asleep and are so sick of it that you can't even handle it anymore. And maybe we're not even looking at you. We're looking down at the floor while we're saying all these things, and in our face, there's no showing. It's flat affect, nothing coming up. So maybe a little overdoing it parody, but there's also people that will show up that will be that obvious. And what happens with that is, obviously, the words. To me, that was where the information content is, just like it was on the bread wrapper. And I send the words across, and I don't give you any intended tonality. I don't give you any intended body language. So what do? Well, there's supposed to be three channels in there. So you take what you saw and what you heard, and you apply what the tonality, so that flat monotone tonality generally means I'm disconnected and not very, into what's going on here. And same thing, flat affect, particularly if I'm not even looking at you, you're going to take that as meaning I'm just not into this thing. Let me out of here, this stinks. Whereas the words could be saying, this is the most exciting project I've ever worked on in my life. But you're getting, this person's just not tuned into it. So you can see big, breakdown in communication, because in one area, I'm not getting all of your communication points that you're sending across, so I'm losing information. In the other area, you're adding in additional things I never put in that's changing what I actually said. So this pretty well describes how communication works. And I'll give you a really, really fast story about how this can break down and cause huge problems. I was working for a company, and they got a new manager. I was assigned to the new team. She and I were having some challenges, we'll say, and hitting it off real well. And we're now, 8 months later, and I'm getting ready to take vacation. And it's the last day before vacation. For whatever reason, every client I was responsible for, it seemed, needed something that day. Definitely wasn't what I had planned. I wasn't able to get them all accomplished. There was 2 items I couldn't get done. Now, I felt bad about it. I mean, I promised them. I wanted to, really do what I promised. What I did was I went and wrote those 2 clients, virtually the identical letter, obviously changed the names, but other than that, they were, the identical emails. And I told them that, hey, I'm so sorry. I got overwhelmed today. A pile of work came in that I wasn't expecting. Totally my fault. I own it. But tomorrow I'm actually starting vacation, but I planned the first day to catch up. So I'm going to get your stuff done first thing in the morning and get it off to you. And of course, I copied my manager in because I wanted her to know that I was being responsible. I was taking ownership of what happened, and I'm being responsible to make sure it got completed. Well, she didn't quite see that way. She felt that communication was totally inappropriate. And I didn't find that out when I sent it. I found out that next morning as I'm working on the people's stuff, I all of a sudden get a instant message from my boss, and the instant message says, "Can you jump on a video call with me right now?" Well, I've been fired enough times to know when you hear something like that, it's not a good sign. But I jump on the video call with her, and she starts telling me, all the things that were wrong with communicating the way I communicated. And, I tell her about how I was like just overwhelmed and whatever. And finally, she says, "Tim, maybe you should consider looking at a new job." Now, I've already told you, I just get the words. So I'm already thinking I'm not in a good shape. This is not like a good setup, having a call like this with your manager. And suddenly I'm being told, go look for a new job. I'm convinced she's telling me that I'm going to get fired. I mean, that's totally what I got out of it. Well, at that point, I said to her, shouldn't we call in HR? And she paused and waited and then finally said, oh, okay. And that didn't make any sense to me because if you're going to fire me, you probably should know we should have HR too. But, went with it. We met with HR lots of times. And what finally came out of it is what she actually meant. So maybe she didn't say it real well, but also I missed her tonality and such that went with it. What she really meant was, Tim, I'm concerned that the responsibilities and needs of this job and your autism may cause you issues health-wise over the long term. And that for your own health, I'm concerned about you, and maybe you should look for another job. That's what she really meant. But I didn't miss I totally missed the concern, the caring that was actually in her voice. I didn't recognize it was there. I just got the words that said, go look for a new job. So that's kind of a person example where you can see how you can totally misinterpret what the other person said due to the fact that I didn't get her full communication. And of course, when I was saying things back, she was adding emotional tone to it that I didn't intend, which made her be totally confused in this conversation. Long story short, we did end up working it out quite well. We became very good friends. We did a number of neurodiversity seminars together. And, there you go. We actually made it work. When we look at this one, this is really kind of, to me, explains the difference between how somebody who is the techie, geeky type autistic and somebody who is neurotypical, the differences in how they think. Now, ideally, this picture would actually be turned around with the left-hand side on the up and the right-hand side on the down, but it just doesn't display on a PowerPoint slide very well going that direction. So just tip your head 90 degrees and, pretend it's going that way. And I'm going to start over on the what's now left should be bottom side. And as an autistic individual, I need details. You give me all the details and I'm going to keep asking for them. I'm going to keep asking for them. I'm going to get all the details I can. And then after I get all those details, I'm going to go and create my own concept and abstraction of what those details, fit into. And what's kind of cool about that is, because I didn't start with a preconceived notion or concept, we tend to be fairly innovative and creative because we're creating something that fits the facts as we see them. We're not starting with a preconceived notion and trying to find facts that fit into it. Conversely, we go to the opposite end, and should be the top, is here left here. And most neurotypicals, we'll say a business person in this case, start from the 50,000 foot view. And then they only start diving in deeper if they need to dive deeper to get their job accomplished. Because they don't go build these things and do these things, they don't know all the details that I use on the left-hand side. So how does this fit in, and why should you care about this? Probably most of you have had one of those interactions where you've had a tech type and a non-tech type and you've been having a conversation over something, and the non-tech type feels like you're just being hammered with questions of this nitpick detail detail that you don't know the answers to. And when you flip it around the other way, the person who's asking for all those detailed questions, and they actually need them to do their job. They're not just being a pain. They actually do need to know these details, but you don't build those things, so you don't know those details. You flip it around the other way, and the person who needs the details is frustrated because you can't give them an answer. You say that I want a web page and I want a box here and a box here and a box here. And they say, well, what font and, how many points and what's the hex colors? And you don't know that stuff. All you know is I need this page to collect this information. And if any of you have ever experienced that from either side, that should really, this kind of points out what is going on. One person is working from the detail level up, one person's working from the top level down, and unfortunately they want their answers where they are. They don't want a middle answer because the middle answer doesn't solve the problem. So we tend to see worlds from the details, which is why we often come up with, as I said, unique and different ways to look at things because we're not starting with the concepts everybody else uses. This here is a concept I came up with that I refer to as the tribe. And where does the tribe fit in and how does the tribe fit in? Well, the tribe fits in that I've been told in my life, I don't know how many times, why can't you be like everybody else? Why can't you do things like everybody else does? And once I was diagnosed, I started thinking about it. Before that, I didn't think about it, but afterwards, I finally started thinking about it, and it dawned on me. The reason is nobody ever gave me or explained to me how I'm supposed to interact or, do things in a way that made sense in my mind. And because of that, I couldn't do that. So now I started thinking, recognizing where the challenge was, how can I come up with a model, a map, some concept that I could use to help navigate the neurotypical, business world? And I came up with this idea of indigenous tribes. And if you think of an indigenous tribe, it tends to be somewhere between, 25, 35 people, few family groups, extremely rigid hierarchy. The chief's the chief till they die. You do whatever you do probably till somebody else dies, and then maybe you'll move into that position. The tribe watches out for itself. The tribe is concerned about things. The worst thing you can do in front of the tribe is shame somebody in front of the tribe. Well, guess what us autistic people tend to do? We have a tendency it comes to our brain and it comes out of our mouth. So let's say we're in a conference room and we're talking about a project and, all of a sudden I say, Mary, you're the one who messed all this up and you did this and you did this and this is what's wrong. Well, that's not going to go over very well in most corporations. And it wouldn't go over very well in the tribe. You could obviously see calling that person out is shaming them in front of the tribe. So tribe model can give you a good idea of how are things going on and why do they work that way. And I actually think that us autistic individuals were the nomads. We're the people who went from tribe to tribe to tribe. We like tribes. Tribes are cool to hang out with for a while, but we can move on to another one. But what happens is they let us in the tribe for a while. We do something that proves we're obviously not part of the tribe, and at that point, they send us packing. Well, how do you get started? What's step one? Now that you've learned a whole bunch of things about neurodiversity and autism, where do you get started with this thing? The first step is get started. No matter what you do or how long you study this, you're going to get something wrong. It's just like diversity. You're not going to get every point right every time. And what do? You get something wrong, you apologize, and you ask for what is the correct way to do it. It's exactly what you do here. And to help you, we're going to get you some tip sheets. One will be about explaining neurodiversity using the NeuroCloud. It has the whole explanation on the sheet. You don't even have to say anything, just hand it to somebody. And the other one's going to, that we've got represented here, and these are just top headers off them, they're longer than that. The other one is about how to make a request in a way that you'll actually get what you're requesting. Designed really for the autistic mind, but the reality is, who that's listening doesn't wish that your boss would tell you specifically what they wanted instead of you having to mind read. So with that, the next step, if you really want to learn about it, is go find somebody who thinks in a completely different way and get to know them. I like to think of a quote from Abraham Lincoln that said, "I don't like that man. I need to get to know him better." And I think that fits perfectly here. And that's what I got for you today, and I'd love to answer your questions. We hope that you've enjoyed another episode of Life in a Neurotypical Universe. Please, if you enjoyed this, share it with your friends. Go take their phone and subscribe them. Heck, it will help us all out. If you want to know more about neurodiversity or have any questions for me, you can reach me at my website, timgoldstein.com, where I'll be more than glad to help you as best I can to navigate through the neurotypical universe.